Today I'll be asking, what does it take to love a bug? We have a problem in the US and worldwide, which is that insect populations are in decline. Insects are important for lots of reasons, including their key roles in supplying food for us and other animals, both directly as prey and indirectly as pollinators, in the recycling of nutrients, and in adding beauty and mystery to our lives. But for most people, this problem isn't on the radar screen of environmental issues. Today's study is the start of a larger project aimed at understanding what people know, think, and feel about insects and the barriers to supporting insect conservation in order to identify ways of increasing support. So, what factors drive concern for conservation in any domain? There are cognitive factors, including knowledge, which is our focus today, as well as risk perception and decision processes. The other major category is motivational, including beliefs, values, and social norms. In most conservation domains, research suggests it's the motivational factors that dominate. Studies typically find that where knowledge is poor, adding more knowledge doesn't necessarily help. However, insects are less prominent in public discourse than topics such as climate change or the ethics of eating animals. Reactions to insects may be less politicized, less guided by social norms, and less likely to tap into deeply held beliefs and values. And the knowledge deficit may be severe. People may know about insects mainly from unfortunate personal experiences, leaving them with negative examples in memory and negative attributes. And they may not know much about the important roles of insects in ecosystems. Addressing a knowledge deficit does sometimes help, in particular knowledge that links causes and effects. For instance, Rennie and Clark found that simple explanations of how greenhouse gases trap heat were more effective at shifting attitudes about climate change than facts about, say, rising temperatures. Insects are deeply embedded in the causal webs of ecosystems. So might causal knowledge carry extra weight in caring about insects? Or is it still fundamentally a beliefs, values, and norms problem? Do insects tap into deep-seated motivations that are not amenable to change? Our study today focused on knowledge, what people know and feel about insects, and the relationship between knowledge, feelings, and support for conservation. We aren't the first to wonder what people think of insects, but we're going beyond past work by probing knowledge and feelings in more detail, including looking at the role of existing causal knowledge and asking how knowledge and feelings relate to support for conservation. Our central questions are the following. Do the insect exemplars' attributes and types of ecosystem interactions that people retrieve from memory tend toward negatively valenced? If so, is that especially true for the first, most readily retrieved information? Do people have more positive knowledge available that might be retrieved a bit later? Is different knowledge retrieved if people think about how insects interact with other organisms and ecosystems before they retrieve other information? And is that knowledge more positively valenced? Again, is there more positive knowledge available? Does the amount of knowledge predict concern for conservation? And does the valence of knowledge? And last, does political orientation predict concern for conservation? Or does knowledge rule in this domain? Now for our method. Our participants were 170 Lehigh University undergraduates. We queried them through a Qualtrics survey that tapped knowledge, associated valences, conservation concern, and some demographics. And I'll explain more about these in a minute. The only manipulation was in the listing tasks. Half the participants retrieved knowledge of how insects interact with other organisms before they retrieved other knowledge about insects, and half retrieved the interactions after they retrieved the other information. In the listing tasks, they were asked to list the attributes of insects in general, and to list examples of insects, and to list attributes of the first and second insect they produced. half the participants listed how insects interact with other living things before they did the other 3 listing tasks, and half did it afterwards. Participants then rated the valence from very negative to very positive about how they felt for each item that they had produced in each of the listing tasks. They then answered 6 questions about the extent of their concern for conservation of insects. And last, they answered some demographic questions that included their rating of political orientation from very conservative to very liberal. They had 30 seconds to list the general attributes, examples of insects, and attributes of the first 2 insects produced. They had 3 minutes to list interactions, and no time limits on the other questions. So what did we find? First, a few descriptors from the listing task. How much do participants produce, and what do they produce? They listed an average of about 5 to 7 insects and attributes, and about 8 ways that insects interact with other organisms, but with a considerable range across participants. For attributes of insects in general, legs, size, movement, and negative emotional responses were the most common. So physical and evaluative attributes dominate what was retrieved, and not functions that insects serve in ecosystems. Ant, bee, fly, and spider were the most commonly listed insects. Spiders aren't technically insects, but we won't quibble about that. Physical attributes were the most commonly listed for the first and second insects produced. When asked how insects interact with other living things, participants thought about insects eating things, pollinating, biting, and being a food source. So now to our first key question: do the retrieved exemplars' attributes and interactions tend toward negatively valenced? The answer to that is yes. The main valence rating for items produced in all 4 of the tasks was slightly below the neutral point of 4 on the 7-point scale. Are the most readily retrieved items the most negative? Do people have more positive knowledge available that might be retrieved a bit later? The answer here is no. Valences of the first 2 items retrieved in each task and valences of the subsequent items are equivalent. Things don't get better after the negative leanings start. Is different knowledge retrieved for those who thought about ecosystem interactions first? A little bit. Those who thought about ecosystem interactions before the other listing tasks tended to list negative emotional responses less. When listing insects, they tended to retrieve bee, an important pollinator, more often. For them, bee was actually the most frequently listed insect. And in keeping with the greater prominence of bees, they tended to list pollinating more often as an attribute. There were no notable differences in the attributes for the first and second insect listed. Is knowledge more positively valenced when thinking about ecosystem interactions first? The answer here is a qualified yes. The valences associated with the items produced in the other listing tasks was higher in all cases for those who retrieved ecosystem interactions first, and significantly so in 2 of the 3 cases. So now we consider what predicts concern for conservation. These will be correlation values, so note that, as you saw already, we had good ranges of knowledge as reflected in numbers of items produced in the 4 listing tasks, and also a good range in the associated valence ratings. The same was true for political orientation and for our measure of conservation concern, which was the average of the 6 individual conservation questions. So does the amount of knowledge predict conservation concern? No, there's no hint of a relationship here. The numbers speak for themselves. Does the valence of the knowledge predict conservation concern? There's a tendency, with 2 of the 4 correlations just about hitting significant. And last, does political orientation predict conservation concern? The answer here is yes, and it's true for all the participants together and for the 2 groups separately. So putting things back together, we started by noting that 2 types of factors can drive concern for conservation in any domain, cognitive and motivational. In our study, we focused on what people know and feel about insects and the relations among knowledge, feelings, and support for conservation. The bad news is that knowledge spontaneously retrieved concerns mainly physical qualities, size, legs, movement, and color, and negative evaluation, and not roles in ecosystems. Knowledge overall tended to be negatively valenced. And not only are the first retrieved thoughts about insects negative, but also the later ones. The good news is that knowledge about ecosystem interactions can be retrieved, and retrieving it before other tasks makes bees and pollination more prominent and tends to increase the valence of thoughts overall. However, knowledge does not predict concern for conservation. Valence has more predictive value, but the link to political orientation is strongest. And this suggests that even in this domain, concern for conservation is dominated by motivations developed outside of the domain itself. Still, the correlation with political orientation was not huge, and that suggests that there's room to shift valences and look for increased support for conservation. How would it be possible to shift valence? Previous work suggests that propositional knowledge, such as that insects are in decline and insects are important, and so on, may be ineffective. The key may be to impart more ecosystem causal knowledge, such as that insects feed fish, birds, frogs, insects pollinate crops, insects enrich soils, insects keep other insects in check. And so the impact of propositional versus causal knowledge will be a focus of our future studies. Thank you.